Hello everyone and welcome to the first lecture of POLI223 Contemporary Populist Politics. This week we'll be looking at different definitions of populism and how we can measure who votes for populist parties. So here is a brief overview of the learning objectives that we'll cover throughout the lecture. This lecture really is key because obviously we will be revisiting these definitions throughout the whole module. So if there is something you don't understand from this lecture, please do speak to your seminar tutor and make sure you've done a fair few of the readings off the reading list. So after this lecture you should have a knowledge of different understandings of what populism is and also how these understandings differ and some of the better ways to measure each type. In your essays, some of the best essays often compare between different types of populism or between different cases, but there needs to be that comparative element in there.
The term populism is dishonest. It's time to say what we really mean. Left-leaning pundits decry both Brexit and Trump as the fatal results of populism. So, when the left wins, it's a triumph of democracy. When the left loses, it's mob rule. A rabble brandishing pitchforks, barbarians at the gate. The Oxford Dictionary defines populism as support for the concerns of ordinary people. Yet lately, populism seems a byword for voters not doing what they're told. To Remainers who want to rerun the referendum until Brexiteers get their minds right, populism means leaving important decisions to a bunch of idiots. Of many ideological hues, populism classically urges common people to unseat an unjust governing class. So the American Civil Rights Movement and Occupy Wall Street were populist. So is Jeremy Corbyn. Yet especially since the EU referendum, commentators use one-size-fits-all populism to lazily lump together disparate movements in the US, Italy, Hungary, Austria, Holland, Germany, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, and France. Missing all the nuances, the American press makes no distinction between UKIP and France's National Front, or the US alt-right. UKIP is populist, period. It's this one word that makes Brexit and Trump seem mistakenly like the same thing. The term is troubling because it's loaded, since anyone who questions unfettered immigration is suspect and backward. Populist has become wink and nod for ignorant, for pig thin. It's polite code for racist, xenophobic, anti-Semitic, and anti-Muslim. Some Trump voters may deserve these pejorative connotations, but Leave voters don't. So before reaching for the euphemism populist, let's try substituting bigoted, because if that's what we mean, we should say it.
Before we start, let's watch this short video from BBC Newsnight and Lionel Sherver. So, as we'll learn in this lecture and throughout the module, Lionel's both right and wrong here. So she's right because the term populism is loaded, it is used negatively, and it is used lazily by journalists and commentators to lump together parties or people with different ideologies, different support bases and different policies, and also different ways of viewing the world. Just because two parties are populist does not mean that they be interchangeable in government or that they are the same. She is wrong because the term populism isn't meaningless. In an academic sense, at least, it has a specific meaning or specific contested meanings, which we will obviously cover. And that's not to say everybody agrees perfectly on what the definition of populism is, but there is a broad consensus about what a populist ideology is, for instance. Throughout this module, I want you to remember this. Populism does have a specific meaning, or indeed specific meanings. It's not a phrase that you can just use willy-nilly. So we'll explore some of those meanings next. Alright, so what is populism? Populism is prevalent across countries and regions. So for example, Gellner and Iconescu in 1969 discussed cases from North America, Latin America, Russia, Eastern Europe and Africa. Mudd and Kaltwasser in 2012 considered the relations between populism and democracy in Eastern and Western Europe, in Canada and in Latin America. And other scholars consider the transnational dimension of populism and the ways in which populist rhetorical frameworks have been diffused and adapted across countries. For example, Sura and Laycock in 2009. No country is immune from populism at all. If populism hasn't emerged within those countries, it might be because certain socio-economic or cultural conditions haven't been met, but that's not to say that populism can never rise in that country. So, for example, Portugal was often held up as an exemplar of a country that has avoided populism until very recently, when a new populist radical right party has emerged and is doing very well in the polls. No party is immune. Pretty much every European country has a populist party. Some now have two, maybe even three, and no party family is immune from populism. And we'll talk about what that means later. Populism isn't new either. It might have received a lot of media attention recently, maybe in the last 5-10 years, but populism is prevalent across historical periods. So, for example, there was the farmers' movement in Russia and the US in the late 19th century. Latin American populism emerged around the mid-20th century, and then we've seen a recent resurgence of populism in Europe, the United States, and Latin America. Other places, like Australia, for example, have long been held up as a country that has just a general populist culture. So whilst it might be harder, or maybe historically harder, to pinpoint a particular populist party, populism infused the rhetoric and the ideologies of all parties. So political cultures can also be more or less populist. And populism cuts not just across geographical borders and historical eras, but also ideological cleavages. In Europe, typically an exclusionary right-wing variant of populism emerged in the 1980s and has intensified since, targeting mostly immigrants and national minorities. Populist right-wing parties are heavily linked to identity and a feeling of exclusion from the benefits of globalization or economic growth, and a sense that culture is changing and they are not happy about that. In Latin America, on the other hand, populism in recent years has been mostly associated with a more inclusionary vision of society, bringing together diverse ethnic identities into shared political frameworks, such as, for example, Evo Morales in Bolivia. This type of populism frequently alludes to clientelism and economic mismanagement. It is typically left-wing, inclusive, and primarily economics-based. And this has inspired left-wing populist movements in Europe as well, such as Podemos in Spain, Syriza in Greece. There are also some less open populist movements. So, for example, the France Insoumise, which is more of a anti-immigration left-wing populist party. And then there's also, in the UK, for example, Respect as an example of a left-wing populist party, or the Scottish Socialist Party. Post-Soviet communist or left-wing parties have embraced populism in Europe as well. Germany's The Left, Die Linke, or the Danish Socialist People's Party are prime examples of post-communist parties. In the United States, populism has been associated with a variety of economic ideologies and political parties, such as the Populist Party of the late 19th century and the New Left of the 1960s, through Southern segregationism to present-day Republican orthodoxy of free market economics, and Trump being a kind of almost unique within the Republican tradition, or the modern Republican tradition, but also heavily populist. Silvio Berlusconi's Forza Italia and Peru's former president Alberto Fujimori have been labelled neoliberal populists, who often position themselves as outsiders to a corrupt system, almost ironically in Berlusconi's case, but who promise to come into office, clean up the corruption, clean up the mismanagement, and to run government as they would run a business, or as they ran their own business. There are also other types of populist movements that perhaps escape classification that we will look at, such as the Five Star Movement in Italy, ANO in the Czech Republic. Both good examples. The range of actors deemed populist should show that the concept itself is contested. For the purposes of this module, we'll consider 3 definitions of populism, which you should use throughout your essays and in answering the questions set for seminars and in your presentations if necessary. And perhaps using 2 or 3 of these as a conceptual framework in your essays would be hugely welcome. So those 3 approaches are populism as an ideology, populism as a discursive style, and populism as a political strategy. So the touchstone of this module will be Mudd's definition of populism as a thin-centred ideology that considers society to be ultimately separated into two homogeneous and antagonistic camps, the pure people versus the corrupt elite, and which argues that politics should be an expression of the general will of the people. So this definition reflects what is termed an ideational approach, which sees populism as an ideology. So let's unpick the key features of this. So thin-centred essentially means that unlike full ideologies like fascism, liberalism, socialism, thin-centred ideologies such as populism contain core concepts which alone are unable to provide a reasonably broad, if not comprehensive, range of answers to the political questions that societies generate. And as such, populism has to attach itself to other ideologies. And this is why you can get populists on the left and populists on the right, populists who want to centralise and populists who want to decentralise, nationalise, privatise, open borders, close borders, etc. So populism is similar in that sense to perhaps nationalism, which only has a set of policies regarding the role of the nation, and perhaps say feminism, which only has answers to questions about gender. Then we have the concept of the pure people. Populists claim to champion the interests of the pure people rather than the corrupt elite. But who are these people? Well, movements have long claimed to speak for the citizens or the common folk, the common people. Liberal democracy is based on the representation of the people, for instance. But populists argue that the people are not just sovereign, but rather a homogeneous and morally pure grouping of people. They are virtuous. They have virtue through just being the people. There are many ways of making the distinction between moral and immoral people, but to be populist, that distinction has to be there. So, for example, Muller argues that this requirement of moral difference is what distinguishes, say, Leninists from populists. Leninists and highly intolerant religious actors do not think of the people as morally pure and unerring in its will. Not everyone who rejects political pluralism is a populist. The basis of that rejection has to be on the morality of the people. Authoritarians may enact policies similar to those enacted by populists, but their justifications are usually based on law and order, for example, rather than those policies representing the will of the people. The Turkish President Erdogan declared at a party congress in defiance of his numerous domestic critics, "We are the people, who are you?" Now, of course, he knew his opponents were Turkish people, as well, but he's making a claim there to exclusive representation of the people. It is not an empirical claim. It's not about falsifying it or testing it. It's always a distinctly moral claim. So, if the people are morally pure, then the defining criteria for the elite is that they are morally corrupt. They can come from a wide range of sources. So, for example, it could be business elites, it could be political elites, it could be media elites, it could be based on nationality, i.e. foreigners, it could be based on kind of ethnic religious groups. So, for example, often Jewish people, or perhaps Hindus or Muslims in some parts of the world, but they all the view is they all aim to frustrate the general will or interests of the morally pure people, and they are there to provide a clear moral juxtaposition, and once in power, the makeup of the elite will change for populists. This is one way or one strategy of allowing populists to maintain their appeal in office. So, for example, Donald Trump, when he was running to be president, it was all about drain the swamp, get into the White House, get into Washington, and kind of start a revolution. And once he got into Washington, it was then more about China and the Republican establishment or the Democrats, rather than talking of draining the swamp. So for Mudd, essential to populist arguments is that the real power does not lie with the democratically elected leaders, i.e. the populists, but with some shadowy forces that continue to hold on to illegitimate powers to undermine the voice of the people. And it's here that the paranoid style of politics most clearly comes to the fore. And as such, populism is inherently based on identity politics. Your identity matters. It is your identity that gives you morality, which then allows you to be divided up. And then we have the concept of the general will. Obviously, populists claim that they are the only people who can identify the general will of the people. This is not derived through a detailed nationwide discussion or debate or polling, or even aiming to be empirically tested, but it's rather by the populists' understanding of the public mood, or this idea, this notion of common sense. It becomes a tool for uniting the people and identifying the enemy. And populist actors, for that reason, usually support the implementation of direct democratic mechanisms such as referenda and plebiscites, whilst at the same time endorsing reductions or constraints on executive power. So you can see in some ways populists boost democracy, but in other ways they undermine democracy, or at least the liberal element of liberal democracy. So populism is a distinctly moral way to see the political world, and necessarily involves a claim to exclusive moral representation by the populist on behalf of the people. And what distinguishes democratic politicians from populists is that the former make representative claims in the form of something like hypotheses that can be tested or empirically disproven on the basis of the actual result of regular procedures and institutions like elections. Populists, by contrast, will persist with their representative claim no matter what, because they claim is of a moralistic and symbolic nature, not an empirical nature, and it cannot be disproven. If a populist loses an election, it is the fault of the elite, or perhaps the people haven't spoken yet, or some notion of false consciousness. Okay, so I think what's important to note here, and what might highlight that moral distinction more clearly, is perhaps comparing it to other ideologies. So in feminism, for example, the key concept is gender, right? That is kind of the key structure of political difference. In Marxism and socialism, social democracy, it is class, right? Political society is structured along class lines. That is the key driver of political life. Liberalism sees the key driver as individualism, individual rights, whereas conservatism sees the key driver as organic society. For populists and obviously nationalists, it's about the nation. For populists, it is about that moral distinction. If the moral distinction isn't there, it's not populist in this understanding. And of course, there are consequences for this definition of populism for political research. So Mudd's ideational approach has been influential in political science research on populism, especially amongst those who focus on European populist right-wing parties, and also increasingly left-wing, but it's just generally important. That's why we're starting first. This is the most common definition you will come across. And if we define populism as an ideology, then a particular methodological consequence will follow. If populism is seen first and foremost as a bundle of ideas, it follows that empirical studies should primarily direct their attention to the programmatic statements made by political actors, treating the latter as the primary unit of analysis, i.e. what populists say matters. Most of this research in this tradition focuses on party literature, either in the form of public manifestos, internal publications, speeches, in order to then classify political actors who produce the literature, i.e. parties or leaders, as either populist or not. Now, in this understanding, there are a few things that populism isn't. It's not elitism. So elitism reverses the moral standing of the elite and the people. But the people are dangerous, dishonest and vulgar, and the elite are superior not only in moral terms, but also often in cultural and intellectual terms. And so elitists want politics to be exclusively or predominantly an elite affair in which the people do not really have a say, or their say is massively restricted. So they either reject democracy altogether, such as dictators like Franco or Pinochet, or they support a very limited model of democracy, such as Schumpeter. Pluralists, the complete opposite of populism and elitism, It rejects their dualism, between the people and the elite, and instead argues that society is comprised of a broad variety of partly overlapping social groups with different ideas and interests. As such, pluralists reject the idea of the general will, and instead argue that society should have many different centres of power, and politics and the role of the state is to bring these groups together through agreement, debate and compromise in order to produce political outcomes. And then we have clientelism, and clientelism isn't the same as populism because it is a particular mode of exchange between electoral constituencies and politicians, in which voters obtain direct goods, e.g. direct payments or privileged access to employment or goods or services, conditioned on their support for a patron or a party. It is a method to maintain and win power. Now, populists may use this, but populism is an ideology rather than clientelism, which is just a means of winning elections and maintaining support. So, in a nutshell, populists do not just try to be popular or to mobilise the people, otherwise they'd just be a catch-all party, like we spoke about in British party politics. Nor do they simply critique the elites, because lots of parties do that. Populists claim that they and only they represent the true people, and this is based on a moral distinction. That's really important. So throughout this module, we'll revisit this definition with regard to our country case studies, and it will form a core part of the presentations as well. We can also look at populism as a discursive style rather than an ideology. This approach is less common in the Western European literature, but it's much more common in Latin American scholarship, and also in scholarship inspired by Latin America on left-wing populist parties, typically in Southern Europe, Podemos and Syriza being the prime examples. Analysing populist politics in Latin America, De la Torre defines populism as a rhetoric that constructs politics as the moral and ethical struggle between el pueblo, the people, and the oligarchy. Similar to Mudd's definition of populism as an ideology, a thin-centred ideology, Kazin argues that the political style of American populism is built on the dichotomy between us and them. Yet, for Kazin, populism is not an ideology that captures core beliefs of particular political actors, but rather a mode of political expression that is employed selectively and strategically by both right and left, liberals and conservatives. There are methodological consequences for understanding populism as a way of expressing politics or speaking politics. Mainly, populism becomes a form of politics rather than a stable category of political actors, i.e. you can have nominally non-populist politicians using populism or populist language in certain policy areas, but not in other areas which might not lend themselves to that populist rhetoric. Richard Hofstadter, in The Paranoid Style in American Politics in 1964, shed some light on the properties of populism as a political style. It's characterized by heated exaggeration, suspiciousness, and apocalyptic conspiratorial worldviews. Leclau is a key theorist in the idea of populism as a discursive style, and he heavily influenced members of Podemos in Spain, Yanis Varoufakis, the former finance minister of the Greek left-wing party Syriza, and Leclau was also an advisor to Presidents Nestor Kirchner and Cristina Fernández de Kirchner of Argentina, both who came from the populist Peronist party. So for Leclau, the symbolic distinction between us and them that constitutes populist discourse is an instance of what he terms relational empty signifiers, that is, a word or idea without a fixed meaning or subject, i.e. us as an empty signifier can take on a varied content depending on the social context and who is doing the articulation. The same with them. These categories gain their meaning through a process of identification, i.e. classification, whereby specific social groups are constructed as the people, us, and pitted against the oppressive others, them. So for Leclau, the problem of populism is precisely that it embraces a range of diverse and often contradictory political beliefs. Movements such as varied as fascism and Maoism, or leaders as distinct as Margaret Thatcher and Hugo Chavez, have all been described as populist in one way or another. But Leclau argued this is no reason to dismiss the category of populist as hopelessly vague or imprecise. The distinctiveness of populism is that it gathers together disparate ideological positions or political demands and stresses their equivalence in terms of a shared antagonism to a given instance of political authority or political power. In other words, populism should be defined by its form rather than its content. It tends to divide, and so simplify, the social field into two distinct camps, championing the people over what Leclau variously terms the dominant ideology or the oligarchy. Leclau and his longtime collaborator Chanel Mouffe argue that left-wing populism was the appropriate successor for the politics of older socialist, social democratic, Marxist, communist Labour parties. It was essentially the way forward for the left, and also rejected the liberal idea of politics as a compromise and instead replaced it with a politics of confrontation or antagonism, which he actually sees as good, right? It's beneficial for the political system because populism will bring in demands from people who are typically ignored by the existing liberal democratic regime. And this is positive because it brings more people into political life. Now, the Leclauian notion of populism is quite complex and it can be quite hard to get your head around. So it is worth reading a few sources because it is important and it will be relevant for your essays and in the exam at the end of the semester. So if you don't understand it, make sure you've done at least a few readings that aim to introduce it, and there's enough on the reading list to get you going. This approach, populism as a political strategy, is particularly prevalent again among sociologists and political scientists working in Latin America. This is much more of an explicitly left-wing approach, at least historically, and focuses on three variants: policy choices, political organisation, and forms of mobilisation. So, policy choices. For Acemoglu et al., populism is seen as the implementation of policies receiving support from a significant faction of the population, but ultimately hurting the economic interests of this majority. And although this is typically played out as left-wing populists critiquing a right-wing economic orthodoxy, it can also work in the reverse manner, a left-wing economic orthodoxy challenged by right-wing populists. For Acemoglu, the driving force of populist politics is the weakness of democratic institutions, which makes voters believe the politicians, despite their rhetoric, might have a right-wing agenda or may be corruptible or unduly influenced by the elite. Populist policies thus emerge as a way for politicians to signal that they will choose future policies in line with the interest of the median voter. Some have criticised this approach, arguing that policy-based definitions of populism cannot account for historical variation in populist ideological positions. An alternative proposed by Wayland is to instead define populism in terms of political organisation. Wayland says populism is best defined as a political strategy through which a personalistic leader seeks or exercises government power based on direct, unmediated, uninstitutionalised support from a large number of mostly unorganised followers. What matters here then is not the content of policies or the style of discourse employed by political actors, but rather the relationship between the allegedly populist actor and their constituents or their followers. Those who define populism as a form of political organisation typically place an emphasis on the identity of the political leaders and their relation to other political actors. Taggart, for instance, argues the populist parties are characterised by a centralised organisational structure headed by a strong, charismatic leader, and because of its lack of key values, populism is particularly liable to the politics of personality. However, Barr, for instance, points to the fact that next to important charismatic populist leaders, there have been non-charismatic populist leaders as well, with Peru's Alberto Fujimori being one example. Consequently, even if charismatic leadership is often associated with populism, it is not a constitutive element of it. And then finally, there's the concept of forces of mobilization. So for Madrid, populism takes the form of particular economic policies and repertoires of mass mobilization. He defends populist mobilization as consisting of anti-establishment and anti-system appeals. Jansen shifts the focus from parties to more general patterns of political mobilization, including social movements. Jansen argues that populism isn't a stable ideology, but instead a political project that can be undertaken by challengers and incumbents of various stripes in pursuit of a wide range of social, political and economic agendas. The three approaches to the study of populism discussed have their differences, but also points of connection and overlap. they are by no means mutually exclusive. So, for example, if we consider populism as a thin-centred ideology, it does not exclude the possibility that populists use a specific discursive style as well. If the goal of populist leaders is to give power back to the common people, it's not surprising that they use the language of the people. It's also reasonable to expect ideology to impact party organisation under some circumstances. If you talk a lot about how, your populist leader understands the will of the people, is in touch with common sense, then it would not be internally consistent to have a wide membership base with a massive say over party policy. Why bother with all that faff when the party leader can just determine policy? So these things are all related. Similarly, in terms of the ideological and discursive approaches to populism, both stress the Manichaean framework of politics and the distinction between us and them as a fundamental component of populist rhetoric. However, there are key disagreements. For example, Kaltwasser and Mudd, whose work employs the ideational approach, criticise Leclau's discursive theory of populism, arguing that it equates populism with all forms of dualistic, i.e. us v them rhetoric, thus stretching the term beyond its theoretical limits and making it too abstract to be the object of rigorous empirical analysis, i.e. it covers far too many bases for it to be actually useful to understand set political phenomena. On the other hand, those who enjoy or who support the discursive approach argue that the exclusive focus on party ideology is overly constraining and essentializing. They argue that populism is discursive, and in a discursive form it is available to all political actors and not only to those who are classified as populist, although some actors may use populist discourse more often than others. So from this perspective, the term populist should not be used as an identity badge, politician X is populist, say, but rather as a methodology or a tool. Politician X is using populism as a flexible mode of persuasion to redefine the people and their adversaries. Similarly, just as there are theoretical links between the ideological and discursive schools, the two approaches can also be brought into dialogue with the research that treats populism as a form of political strategy. Barr, for instance, makes this argument with regard to leadership. If populist ideas are about the will of the people, then populist movements are likely to require strong leadership able to represent the interests of the people and avoid intermediary organisations that may distort those interests, such as political parties, such as social movements, such as the courts, such as constitutions, etc., etc. As such, in future weeks, when we look at populist actors, and specifically in terms of case studies, I do want you to consider all three approaches, especially in your essays. In fact, this table and these three approaches provide a neat analytical framework for analysing parties and political movements, which you should use. And I think what's also important to note is the different units of analysis and the different relevant methods that each school employs. So to highlight the diversity in populist thought, I've included a chart from the website Populist. This is just one example of a great data source on populist parties. So for example, if you're looking to generate case studies, if you're looking to justify why you've chosen a particular party in your essay, Populist is a good opportunity for European parties where you can go, oh, Populist says this party is both left-wing and populist, and this party is left-wing and not populist. I'm going to compare the differences. Populist is how you justify your case. There are other data sets all available, on Google, obviously, but also on the reading list. And if you find something that isn't, please do send it to me and I'll put it on there. But yeah, just a heads up that there is a lot of information on the reading list that you should utilise. Anyway, to highlight the diversity in populist thought, here is a chart from Populist. This has mapped out all European parties which can be classified as populist, far right, far left, and /or Eurosceptic, and obtained at least 2% of the vote in at least one national parliamentary election since 1998. Now what this chart shows is that you get populism on the left, right? You get populism on the right. You get populists that are neither, and then you also get populists that are Eurosceptic but can't be identified as far left or far right. Now, what is more interesting is not all Eurosceptic parties are populist, as we can see. The fifth column shows that there's 12 parties in this case that can be just seen as Eurosceptic, and also that Euroscepticism isn't the realm of just the far right. Far left parties are Eurosceptic as well. there are 23 far-left Eurosceptic parties, non-populist, but there are also a further 9 far-left populist Eurosceptic parties. Okay, and also not all far-left parties are populist, but there seems to be more far-left Eurosceptic non-populist parties than there are far-right non-populist Eurosceptic parties. Populism seems to be more common on the far right, as we can see, on the different graphs where those are relevant measures. But let's not minimise the fact that there are a fair few far left populist parties. Please bear that in mind. And it's a great resource. Please do use it. Here's another example of data viz. This draws on data from the Popper dataset. And what it does essentially, again, this is using the ideational approach. Most of these types of data sets will do that because it's much easier to measure than the other subsets, and it's also just more popular. Now what this shows is European parties, political parties, on the left-right position and scored in terms of populism. What each dot, or the colour of each dot, represents that party family, the party family that party comes from, and then what we call bags in data viz, but the shaded areas represent the area where 75% of the cases within that party family fall. So it basically shows you where those parties cluster ideologically. Now what is interesting is that the only group firmly in a populist quadrant is the radical right. Okay, so they are, as we'd expect, on the right, and they are, as we'd expect, populist. Now the radical left, the big red bag on the left, most of the radical left are populist, although there are a fair few that fall in the lower half, the lower quadrant, so are not fully populist. Now Greens don't fall into the populist at all, but they are on the left. Liberal parties, very few liberal parties are even slightly populist. Social Democratic, that's the pink one, they tend to be not populist, but some parties do use elements of populism. And then you've got conservative parties that, on the right, and some of them are populist, some of them aren't. It's almost a 50-50 split. But we can see that really populism is not, and there are other party families there that I've not included in the analysis in terms of the bags, because it'd just be a complete mess. But what we do see is that whilst populism is not unique to a certain party family, right? So we see elements of populism being a thin-centred ideology that needs a host ideology to latch onto. We can see that there. It is much more common in certain party types than others. If you are interested in making your own graphs for essays or presentations, then please do. That would be really good. The next slide is just a video about Euroscepticism. Please watch it.
I have to get used to, all of you.
Britain's UKIP wants out of the EU. Podemos in Spain and the Greek Syriza movement would like a different EU. The Front National in France would even like the EU to just go away. These are political extremes on the far right and the far left, but all of them are attacking the very principles of the EU. Mr. Tsipras, we have radically different positions on many issues, but one thing we have in common, we want to give the people back their voice and fight the European and technocratic dictatorship. Marine Le Pen has repeatedly claimed that France is being led from Brussels. With success, the right-wing populist could easily be a deciding factor in the 2017 presidential elections in France. Nationalistic also fits the bill for Nigel Farage and his UKIP party. Britain needs to leave the EU, he claims, otherwise the country would be flooded by immigrants. In Greece, Alexis Tsipras, a left-wing populist, even managed to become prime minister. Some think his party, Syriza, together with Spanish Podemos, could be the foundation for a socialist revolution in Europe. Syriza's enemy number one, Angela Merkel, and her focus on austerity. That's what Syriza's left wing has rebelled against. For a Greece without bailout, without austerity, without guardians, a Greece that is democratic, progressive, and at the end of the day, socialist. No more guardians from Brussels, that's what they all want, be it Syriza or the Front National. Unsurprisingly, a majority of people in populist strongholds tend not to trust the EU. According to the European Commission, in Front National's France, 51% distrust the EU. In Podemos Spain, it's 54%. In UKIP's territory, the United Kingdom, it's 55%. And in Syriza's Greece, it's a whopping 73%. All of these countries are above the EU average, but that's still 46%. That's fertile ground for Europe's populists, whether they're from the right or the left.
Have to get used to, all of you.
Britain's UKIP wants out of the EU. Podemos in Spain and the Greek Syriza movement would like a different EU. The Front National in France would even like the EU to just go away. These are political extremes on the far right and the far left, but all of them are attacking the very principles of the EU. Mr. Tsipras, we have radically different positions on many issues, but one thing we have in common, we want to give the people back their voice and fight the European and technocratic dictatorship. Marine Le Pen has repeatedly claimed that France is being led from Brussels. With success, the right-wing populist could easily be a deciding factor in the 2017 presidential elections in France. Nationalistic also fits the bill for Nigel Farage and his UKIP party. Britain needs to leave the EU, he claims, otherwise the country would be flooded by immigrants. In Greece, Alexis Tsipras, a left-wing populist, even managed to become prime minister. Some think his party, Syriza, together with Spanish Podemos, could be the foundation for a socialist revolution in Europe. Syriza's enemy number one, Angela Merkel, and her focus on austerity. That's what Syriza's left wing has rebelled against. For a Greece without bailout, without austerity, without guardians, a Greece that is democratic, progressive, and at the end of the day, socialist. No more guardians from Brussels, that's what they all want, be it Syriza or the Front National. Unsurprisingly, a majority of people in populist strongholds tend not to trust the EU. According to the European Commission, in Front National's France, 51% distrust the EU. In Podemos Spain, it's 54%. In UKIP's territory, the United Kingdom, it's 55%. And in Syriza's Greece, it's a whopping 73%. All of these countries are above the EU average, but that's still 46%. That's fertile ground for Europe's populists, whether they're from the right or the left.
So this was going to be a fun game, everybody's favourite party game of who is the populist, and you've got to basically guess the party from the logos or from the people. I mean, it's a lot less fun when it's done like this, so we won't play it. But what I will do is include the all the information in the order it will be presented, I think, in the notes to this slide. All right. Rugin finds that there is actually no all-encompassing trait which results in a populist voter, and that the other ideological elements of the party, i.e. whether it's on the right or the left, the national context of the voting system perhaps, rival parties, all of that type of thing matters. So there's, again, something else to bear in mind. There is nothing special about populism, and there is nothing special about populist parties that mean voting for them is essential for some groups, or that voting for them by other groups is like beyond the pale. They are just a different type of political party in the sense that they have a different ideology. But you can get people, in the same way you can get people on the left who don't vote for left-wing parties, you can get people who are not populist, who vote for populist parties, and vice versa. So is this surprising? Well, it shouldn't be, right? They're just parties. There's nothing special about them. This module could have a partner module on social democratic parties or conservative parties or liberal parties, okay? And it's not the relationship between support for populists and the wider context goes beyond just losers of globalization or, you know, left behind voters. That's a shorthand, but not all left behind voters vote for populist parties. Not all losers of globalization vote for populist parties. For example, for a long time, UKIP support was from quite wealthy former conservatives in the southeast of the country. Okay, they're not exactly left behind. So populist voting is just as complex as voting for any other type of party, and it will vary from country to country. So that's something to bear in mind. So let's look at who votes populist compared to voting for a mainstream party. And this is from Region 2017. This table might look quite complicated, but it really isn't. So firstly, what it represents is it shows variables that have a statistically significant correlation between that individual characteristic and support for various populist parties. Positive correlations are shown as a plus, negative as a minus, and a blank space means there's no statistically significant relationship. Firstly, if we thought that the drivers of populism in each country was the same, we would expect to see all squares shaded or non-shaded, and we would expect the signs to go in the same direction, which is not always the case. Okay, so amongst the radical right parties, a dislike of immigration seems to be the main constant across all parties, which is what we'd expect. We can also see that political distrust is often a strong motivator in a lot of cases, but not all cases. So the FPO, for example, in Austria, political distrust doesn't seem to be an issue. Going back to what we said about Euroscepticism, for only two parties in Europe does Euroscepticism play a role. So it's by no means synonymous with populist radical right voting. Demographic, issues also play a role. So populist voters tend to have lower levels of education. They tend to be younger, and I think the negative sign for gender means they tend to be men. And in some cases, they tend to be less religious. So that's interesting. It doesn't tell us. What is also interesting is the role of satisfaction with economy and satisfaction with government. So in the case of the Flemish bloc, VB, satisfaction with the economy increases the likelihood of voting for that party, whereas it decreases the likelihood of voting for the Danish People's Party, the Danish Folk Party, DF. Similarly, satisfaction with government reduces the likelihood. If you're more satisfied with government, you're less likely to vote for the Flemish bloc or the Swiss People's Party, but you're more likely to vote for the Danish Folk Party. These are relationships that you should explore in more detail to maybe explain. Now, when it comes to the radical left, you can see that you're more likely, the more you earn, the less likely you are to vote for the radical left. The more religious you are, the less likely you are to vote for them. And the more you're in favour of income redistribution, unsurprisingly, the more likely you are to vote for the radical left. And this ties back to the idea that populist voting isn't that different to normal voting in the sense that it can appeal to your incentives rather than, necessarily some deeper cultural issue. If you think there should be income redistribution and a radical left party is the one that you think is most likely to deliver that, you'll vote for them. There's no relationship for Euroscepticism here. And so what I want to hammer home here is that there is a constellation of different populist parties, and the drivers of voting for these are completely different. Okay, so it's not worth. Please don't lump them all together. Okay, there is no one-size-fits-all populist voter. Okay, so this week's lecture has been a bit shorter than they normally be, but it's because it's an introductory one. There is a lot of reading for this week because there's a lot of areas to cover, and I want you to have a good grounding and a good understanding, because basically if you don't get this week, the rest of the module is going to be very difficult for you. So please do use the resources provided to make sure you understand what's going on. Remember, you can find the presentations for week 2 in the module handbook. You can find the seminar questions in the module handbook. If you have any questions, please email them to me. And what I'll do is I will start an FAQ or something on the Vital page. So please do check there before asking me a question, just to save a load of repetitive labour. But if it's not on there, or I haven't made it yet, please do send me an email. Yeah. So if you have any questions, please do email me. My email is on the first slide. Thank you for, I guess, coming. I don't know. Whatever.